Hello, everyone. Welcome to my podcast, Divorcing with Dignity. I'm Shoshana Goldstein-Nissenbaum, a Toenet Rabbanit, a halachic advocate, and a mediator. And today we have a very special guest, Rabbi Johnny Solomon. Rabbi Johnny Solomon has a BSc in Math and Religious Studies, an MA in Jewish Education, and Smicha from Montefiore Kollel. He's the Chief Learning Officer, I love that, CLO, of Web Yeshiva, and works as the virtual rabbi, offering online spiritual coaching and halachic consultation sessions to men, women, and couples. Beyond this, Rav Johnny lectures for Matan, Herzog College, LSJC, and Marital. He writes a popular daily insight on Daf Yomi. He's a contributor to the RZ Weekly podcast. He officiates at weddings under the auspices of Tzohar, and he is a postic to the local shul in Even Shmuel. Hi, good morning. Welcome.
Good morning, Shashi. Thanks so much for having me. It's LSJS, but that's not important. And it's great to be here. And thank you for all that you do. We've been in contact over a period of months already. And not only am I incredibly impressed, but incredibly thankful for the guidance you give, the resource that you provide. And just recently, I sent somebody to be in contact with you because I needed them to hear from somebody in the field. And I know that they've been very, very appreciative from what they've learned from your guidance.
Okay, thank you, Baruch Hashem. Always happy to help. So today our topic is religious abuse. Now, religious abuse is complicated. Okay, so before we get into the definition of what religious abuse is, I think it's important to make a clarification that there's a mental illness called OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. That's not what we're talking about today. We're not talking about somebody who has an illness where they cannot control themselves and therefore adapt all kinds of eccentric or extreme religious practices. We're talking about religious abuse, and religious abuse is defined in the following way. Religious abuse is abuse administered through religion, including harassment or humiliation that may result in psychological trauma. Religious abuse may also include the misuse of religion for selfish, secular, or ideological ends, such as the abuse of a clerical position. So when we're talking about a marriage, when we were talking about this beforehand, a religious abuse within a marriage, and it works both ways, right? Everyone should keep in mind that men religiously abuse women, women religiously abuse men. It's not that only men are abusive religiously. So we were kind of going back to the beginning, and that is, what is a marriage? What weight does each person put in the marriage in terms of religiosity? So maybe you want to start and help us understand, what does that mean? Because when I think about a couple, right, it is a team. It's a board of directors with both of them have a seat at the table. It's not one using their power, right? If we think about physical abuse, so it's the stronger party or using some kind of force. It could be throwing an object, but it's using physical power to dominate over somebody in a hurtful and a harmful way. And, psychological abuse, it would be saying certain things, it's certain behavioral patterns, which is using the power of those words or those behavioral patterns to hurt the other person.
Or harnessing certain mechanisms. The point is, we assume that in terms of physicality, a person can be stronger than the next person. But we often assume in terms of psychology that everybody has the capability of rising above any natural weakness. But if a mechanism gives more power or more opportunity or defaults more to one than the other, then that can be a recipe for strife. That can also be a recipe for just knowing how to get on in life. But that will depend on each individual couple. So what I thought we'd do is we'd begin by talking about a marriage where two people come with slightly different customs or practices, which is pretty much every marriage. It's important to know. Even if you live in the same religious community, different families do things differently. So marriage is already a union of two different people with different worldviews, different life experiences. And now when talking about religion, different religious practices or different religious sensitivities, even if they look like the same religious practices.
And
The
we're
question
recording
is,
this Erev
sorry,
Rosh Chodesh Nisan, Pesach,
right,
the holiday
Pesach,
of customs. I think between my colleagues and I, we've decided that post-Pesach is the highest divorce rate season.
And I get, as a rabbi, as a virtual rabbi, and I deal with spiritual coaching and halachic consultations, I particularly address these kind of questions where issues of halacha and hashkafa outlook play out in family settings, in relationships, meaning people aren't calling me to ask necessarily if this matzah is kosher. Of course, I'll tell them, but the kind of sessions I have with people are generally when we have this interplay between custom and law and family dynamics or work dynamics. And yeah, Pesach can be a really tricky thing because people are very strict about Pesach because the Torah itself is very strict about Pesach. And sometimes it means that relationships are put second because halacha seemingly is put first. Firstly, in many instances, the people who are making that decision are not au fait with halacha themselves. They're making erroneous decisions, which is why I encourage them to meet with me. But even where they be making the right decisions, sometimes it can leave a bitter taste in the mouth above and beyond the maror, whereby people have insisted on doing one thing and somebody will capitulate, whatever that may well be. There are a million different varieties of different practices and customs, but that can lead to forms of religious abuse in the home around Pesach time, where a person feels they have to cower to the insistent ways of some. That could be a child towards a parent, parents towards a child, siblings, etc., etc. And certainly within the marital framework, where one person may well say, a wife may well say to the husband, we're doing things this way. But he'll say, I have a different opinion. She'd say, this is how we're doing it. And the other way around as well. Now, people don't always agree. And of course, life itself is about knowing how to get along and move forward when you don't agree. Still, religion can easily be weaponized. And we create this kind of aura of severity, especially around Pesach and Chametz, or around many other areas too. Of course, Tarat HaMishpacha, Kashrut, etc., etc. Many areas are sacred to us. And when we disagree about the sacred, it can really make what would be a tame conversation where you're disagreeing about other minor matters into a very, very severe disagreement, sometimes an aggressive one, God forbid, sometimes even a violent one. So religious abuse happens in many different ways. And when people call me already, it's often they've got some scrapes that have arisen through kind of disagreement. And my task is to try and help make sure it doesn't escalate. I'm not a therapist, I don't purport to be. My job is to give sound halachic advice, but with a sensitivity towards the wider concerns for harmony and shalom bayit. And halakha considers harmony and shalom bayit to be meta halachic considerations, whereby oftentimes things which you would think are serious, actually we would advise people to tone that down for the sake of the wider good.
You said something which I think was so wise, and you said it really fast. I just want to go back to it. And that was that some people will tend to put the halacha first and the relationship second. Yeah. And really in the relationship between a husband and wife, very often halacha puts the relationship first, right? Halacha will say, no, you gotta, you gotta take care of your wife. You have to be respectful of your husband in those ways. And it will be, the halacha will be used in the wrong way without the addendum of what's priority.
Right. This is, it's not such a singular thing, but this is the difference between book law and real law. Basically, book halacha, and the kind of halacha that I've received from my teacher, Mori Rabbi Dain Gershon Lopyan, who was not just a great posset, but a great person who really interwove within all of his psakim a sensitivity to ben adam lachaver, especially shalom bayit, which is we have a masorah of priorities, of hierarchies. Now, sometimes that's not written explicitly in the Shulchan Aruch. which says, do this and do that. But really there's an overlay, which says, do this and do that, but don't do it if it's going to make somebody upset. Don't do this if it's going to cause, disagreement in the home.
Called the
I'll give you a very, sorry.
The
please.
fifth volume of the Shulchan Aruch. Seichel.
Right. In fact, I don't know if you're aware, there's a Rav in Israel who's actually written volumes titled the fifth volume of Shulchan Aruch, trying to incorporate, put in a book form what those extra things are, whether that's achievable or not, who knows. But I'll give you a very simple example, practical example. I'm a rabbi, I'm somebody who spends my life learning Torah and teaching Torah. That means when I come to the Seder night, I could spend the whole night long sharing Divrei Torah, and I'd love to hear the same as well. But I also know that it takes effort to create a Seder. We all help in our home. Obviously, I take that as for granted. But it means that especially when Seder starts late, people are tired and people are hungry. Now, if you look in many Haggadahs, you have many, many Divrei Torah, and people think the right religious thing is to say many Divrei Torah. Of course, the cost of that is Shulchan Aruch, the meal comes very, very late. If you open the Stipler's Haggadah, right? The Stipler was a great Torah scholar and certainly not known for his liberalism. He says, I don't understand. Say the Haggadah and say the Divrei Torah during the meal. Like, who on earth said you have to say the Divrei Torah at the cost of people being able to eat, people being able to relax? Who on earth said it has to be either or, halacha or relaxation? And wise, sensitive teachers, such as he and such as many others, basically will guide us to know how to interweave a sensitivity of Ben Adam L'Chavera to, and an absolute commitment of Ben Adam L'Makom, whatever the mitzvah may well be, Sipi, Tzim, Mitzrayim, etc. Who's to say you can't wait till a meal and say many, many Divrei Torah whilst you're having whatever you're drinking or eating or whatever? So that's a tiny example of so many. But the frum person thinks, oh, I finished my Seder at 3 a.m. We started eating at 12. I say, you're an idiot if that was you. That's not frum, that's stupid, right? You start eating within a reasonable time because people want to start eating. You want to say Divrei Torah until you fall asleep, which you should. Great, fantastic. But don't do it at the cost, especially when you've got older relatives or younger children. And that, by the way, then creates a certain negativity associated with Seder night, which is nora. That's a terrible thing. That's a horrific thing. So yatsa schar b'hefsedo. Ultimately, any gain you said with the Divrei Torah are lost by the kind of atmosphere you created. Be that as it may, we've just kind of going slightly left field. Let's just talk on a simple level about minhagim, about customs. So husband and wife get married, they come with different customs, even within the same community, people have different practice. What is a default? The default, and there's no way of getting around it in terms of the general Masorah, the general tradition, the Tashbit says this, the default is generally that women adopt the customs of their husband, but we do so, and it's important to know, that's not because women have to do what men says. It means sometimes you actually have to make a choice. And our overall goal is not women do what men say. Our overall goal is shalom bayit, harmony, a unified home. And how things were in bygone times where men would learn and women wouldn't have so much formal learning, that kind of seemed to fit with the way of the world and the way of the home. And many of our ancestors, until very recently, a woman would simply adopt the minhagim, the husband, and in many instances, this was not a terrible affront, nor was it seen to be. A person enters somebody else's home, and so be it. But again, the underpinning of that practice was to create a unified home. Now, what that means is, what happens if a woman has certain minhagim that are really precious to her? Is it possible for her to continue? Of course, as long as you're able to maintain a unified home. And in fact, there may well be minhagim that the woman does that the guy wants to adopt. Is that permitted? Yes, the Bnei Bonim discuss this and other people too. As long as your aspiration and your directionality of how you're running your home is to create a unified, harmonious home. So while the default of minhagim...
When you have a couple who's coming, right?
Yes.
You have a couple who's getting married. Before, most women know this. They know that if they marry, an Ashkenazi woman marries a Sephardi man, or vice versa, that they know that they're going to have to adapt to certain cultures, and they make that decision beforehand, meaning
Hmm.
a Sephardi woman who marries an Ashkenazi man or vice versa knows that things are going to be different, right?
Yeah.
But when a lot of times where I see the religious abuse and the misuse of power is after they're married, one of the spouses becomes enlightened, right? They go to some kind of retreat, they try psychedelic mushrooms, they Pito have this like great spiritual moment, right? Where they found this new rabbi, or they, this something new, and this is now what we're going to do. Okay, whether it's, and we could take extreme examples. Okay, we could take a woman who decides to put on a shawl. Okay, which, those of us in Israel, we see that a lot. You walk around Yerushalayim, where I live in Tzfat, right? We see it a lot. Okay, where she has decided that this is what, or this is what she wants to do, or maybe her husband is, demanding that she do this. I don't know. Either way, it's a new, like, oh, this is going to be a new thing. Or he comes home and he's just heard even something simple. I heard a shiur now on the importance of Tosefet Shabbat, of adding on to Shabbos. So I want to, from now on, we are keeping Rabbeinu Tam. Now, when I look at that, to me, that's antithetical to what a marriage is. Because if you're coming with your minhagim, that's one thing. But now that you've had this spiritual awakening or halachic awakening, and then to force the other person, or even to take upon oneself a chumrah without being in sync, I don't know if it's abuse, depends what it is, but to me, it's anti-Torah. To me, it's anti what a relationship is. A relationship is about discussing, does this work for us? Does this work for our family? Is this good for us? Is this not good for us? Can we do this? Is it sustainable? Is the change too much? Maybe you could do your thing. You could keep Rabbeinu Tam, but I'm not ready for Rabbeinu Tam. I'm not ready to, keep Shabbos to go out at 9:30 in the summer. Like, I'm just not ready for that. So it's like that's when I find the real struggle comes up. I think people have an expectation when they get married, things are going to change. But it's the whoa, and those are things that need to be worked out. I don't think that a husband could come home and say, from now on, we are keeping Rabbeinu Tam, or from now on, I am going to Uman every year, right? Like, you can go to Uman, but that has to be a discussion. That's not something that, I mean, again, I don't know if this is exactly abusive, right? I mean, it could be abusive, it could be turned into abusive, but the concept of, I'm going to decide what we're doing and you're going to do what I do, and it could be the opposite also. I've had couples who come to me where, the woman became extremely close to a certain rabbi, and she has to do everything that rabbi says. And, everything is changing now. The whole house is changing. I had a client once who I was representing her, but she threw out all the English books in the house because Rabbi X says you shouldn't have English books, right? And Rabbi X says, I represented a man who his ex-wife insisted that he not work and he only learned Torah. Of course, she used that against him in court, that he didn't provide. But to her, she had shamed people so much who go out to work and don't learn Torah all day, that that, in my opinion, is abusive, right? To shame someone to the point and say, no, don't work, don't provide. Hashem will take care of us, and whatever, which was tzedakah, right? And she didn't put a gun to his head and say, don't go out to work. But the shame that she put on him and the criticism was, you have to learn Torah all day. That is using the concept of learning Torah to assert power and authority over the other person. And that's abusive.
I agree entirely in all those cases. And almost all of them are cases of abuse. And they negate the very basis of even the most simplest of minhag change that we talked about, which is to try and maintain a unified home. That means if on the simple things that we bring into a home, there always needs to be a sensitivity to harmony and shalom bayit. If we're going to bring anything else, there is a prerequisite, which is, you know that phrase, do no harm? Well, do no harm applies to halacha too. If you're going to bring a law, and in particular a custom, and in particular a stringency, before even considering it, the question is, will this do harm? And the only person that you should be first talking to is the person that's going to most affect, namely your spouse. You can be inspired by whatever, you can read whatever book you want, but it doesn't, it's a bit like an animal on a leash. It doesn't get in the house unless you check that that's not going to, make the other person sneeze or agitated or cause tension or problems. But it's important to unpack what you've said, Shosh, in a couple of different ways. Firstly, let's take you to a couple where they're not so observant, and one kind of then gets more inspired and wants to keep Shabbos. Okay, well, then that's somebody wishing to lean into normative halachic observance. Now, according to Jewish law, we are all for that. We think that's a great thing. In fact, arguably, if a person wishes to do that and the other spouse isn't interested, there could be justification for saying, I don't want this marriage. However, there's a really important distinction, which unfortunately amateur halachists don't understand. Amateur halachists means people who haven't had real shimush of real poskim, which is a difference between psika, halachic decision-making, and eitzah, basically good recommendations for maintaining unity in a home. If somebody were to come to me and one member of the couple is more religious than the other, more observant than the other, and they say, should I encourage my spouse to be more Shabbat observant? According to my halacha head, the answer is yes, of course. I'm all for keeping Shabbat. But again, remember, I'm interested in also maintaining a good home, and assuming that the couple, broadly speaking, like each other, love each other, get on with each other, there's just been a little bit of change, then you need to ask yourself, there may come a tipping point where the practice of one makes it impossible for them to live with the other. But that may not happen at all. And you may need to say to that person, listen, in terms of halacha, it's great that Jews should keep Shabbat. But in terms of my eitzah, you should do what you do. And you should be very, very reasonable, open-minded, flexible, and compromising to whatever your spouse does, because you should always bear in mind the implications of harmony and shalom bayit. And when helping couples on different halachic levels, there is an interplay of eitzah, advice, which is not necessarily purely rooted in halakha, but instead draws its energy from these deeper meta-halachic considerations such as shalom bayit and halakha itself. Because we care about harmony, we care about holding homes together that wish to be held together. Obviously, if they don't, that's a different matter. That's point number one, the difference between eitzah and halakha. So sometimes the right advice to an individual actually almost goes against halakha, but actually it goes towards the deeper roots of Jewish living, namely shalom bayit, harmony.
We see that in the Beit Hadin too, because there have been many, many cases, and this is Harav Ovadia Zecher Tzaddik Livracha wrote a lot about that. There would be a couple things would start shaking up, right? So a lot of times the man would be chozer b'tshuva. He's now keeping Shabbat, and they got married as secular people, and he comes to the Beit Hadin and he says, my wife has to take a divorce and she's not going to get her ketubah because she doesn't cover her hair. And Rav Ovadia said, no way. That is religious abuse. That is using something from the Torah, from the Shulchan Aruch, in a way which it was not meant to be used. When you got married, you knew who she was, right? You were not religious, right? And so now you can't come and say, well, retro, I want a refund. It doesn't work that way. You gave her a ketubah as she was then.
But I'll tell you more than that. I mean, Rav Ovadia was a giant, but Rav Moshe Feinstein goes further and says, imagine a couple were religious and then she stops covering her hair. That's still not grounds. I'll explain later. But that's still not grounds for various different reasons. But you're entirely right. And why does Rav Ovadia say that? And I've got his response just here to my left, and I had this thought of meeting him. He says this because the ultimate values of Judaism are bigger than a singular practice law or custom. That doesn't mean we don't care about that. Rav Yosef was an expert.
Of
I mean,
course he
the
cared about halacha.
of course,
And
but
the
he cared
courts now,
more.
the Rabbanut, even with the children, if one
Yes.
parent becomes religious, even ultra-Orthodox, but they were married as a secular couple, so a lot of times they'll run to the Beit Hadin instead of the family court because the father or the mother, whoever became religious, wants to put the children in a religious school. And the courts will not do it. And I'm talking about the Beit Hadin Rabbanit. They say the kids have to have stability. So if they started off in a not religious gan, that's where they're staying. And if they started off in an ultra-Orthodox gan, that's where they're staying. You can't, they're not plants. You can't just take them from one place to another. They're human beings. And what's best for their religious being is for them to be healthy human beings. And to be a healthy human being, you can't take a kid who's been for 6 years in a mixed secular co-ed school and dump them into some school in the middle of Bnei Brak. The family court will definitely not do it, and the Beit Hadin will not do it. And people make that mistake. They think, oh, I can, and so the family unit, and I've seen this in many, in Shailot V'Tshuvot, in many responsa, that the most important thing is the family unit. So if the family unit is unhealthy, the family unit is unhealthy. But the halacha does not allow for the halacha to be used in order to hurt somebody. That's not halachic. And to hurt children, to hurt
problem is, by the time it gets to a bet din, and we know that there are the odd outliers who don't see the world that way, but we also know that actually people who are really invested in and knowledgeable about and have experience in psika of that level do follow through and do understand that broader system. But until it gets to that kind of system, let's say, take an example, a husband will continue the narrative as if he knows better. And firstly, he probably is even ignorant about this wider consideration. And he will weaponize, or she will weaponize in other instances, halakha, as if to say this is the be all and end all. And sometimes I've seen people like that. It's very unsettling. It's ugly. It is a fraud. It's important to say it is being mezayef. It is to fraud the Torah. It is to take Torah and to manipulate ideas in order to achieve power and to abuse and to hurt others. It is the ugliest thing that I know, and I've seen it sadly many times. So even if though the Bate didn't say that, for the period of time that a couple are not going to the bet din and instead they're having disagreements in the home, this is a kind of rhetoric that's often used. So I just want to touch upon, we mentioned chumrot, the simple rule of thumb about chumrot, and this applies man to woman, woman to man. No matter what you choose to adopt, however impressive it is, and here we're talking not about normative Jewish law, but we're talking about customs. If you adopt normative Jewish law, matov, wonderful, but still there needs to be sensitivity about if that can be brought into the home and how. But especially if you adopt a stricture, namely something which is above and beyond the basic demand of Jewish law, you have no right to demand that of your spouse. You have no right. There's a response from Rav Moshe Feinstein where a man writes, it's fascinating. A man writes basically saying, I have a stricter view about hair covering and I think my wife should keep it. Rav Moshe Feinstein basically says, thanks so much for sharing. She shouldn't. Because no, you don't have the right to demand strictures of your spouse. You can choose what you want of yourself. You can demand what you want of yourself, but you certainly do not have that right to ask on others. And even, as you say, when a person adopts for themselves, it should be done with sensitivity. Just a quick ma'aseh, when I made Aliyah, although technically I'm Sephardi from birth, but I grew up in an Ashkenazi community, and I kept 3 hours between meat and milk. When I made Aliyah, soon after I'd studied for Smicha, I decided I want to adopt 6 hours, which is certainly, according to Maran, but Yosef, the preferred way of doing things. But there was never, ever a consideration that my wife and kids would do so. And I only did so on consultation with her. What does that different mean? On Sudat Shlishit, so she is and I don't. But adopting things like that, firstly, again, has to be with consultation with a spouse, having heard some kind of feedback, and by no means, never, ever would I ever demand anything of a spouse, even if I'm very particular, if it's a strict or even the normative halakha of law, which you're upgrading to, but that's not what you were doing until that point. As you say, you met without that being what you did, and thus you should expect to continue. And if anything changes, that's on you, but that's not on anybody else.
You know, there's a very common phenomenon of the narcissistic type. Now, I'm not saying narcissistic personality disorder, but somewhere on the spectrum of the narcissistic type, who they seem to have something in common where they tend to quote certain psukim, and it's always the same psukim over and over and over again, which talk about punishment for disobedience, which, you know, focus on shaming somebody, and they use them. They use them as a shame tactic, as a scare tactic, to get family members, a spouse or children, to do their bidding, right? Which includes not divorcing sometimes, which is something I see a lot, not giving a get or not receiving a get. And this is a statistic that most people don't know and don't like to hear, but in the Rabbanut, in the Beit Din of the Rabbanut here in Israel, the majority of cases which are stuck, 60%, are because the woman will not receive her get. She is the get refuser. In any event, not, you know, and he's saying, oh, the Mizbeach is going to cry, and it's a horrible, like, that is taking something out of context and using it to try to force somebody to do not God's bidding, but your bidding, because to the narcissist, they are actually God, right? That's what they think of themselves. So they can do anything they want, and they kind of slice off the psukim, right? Or they'll slice off the parak. Well, they'll only use the part about punishment, or they'll only use the part about the disobedience, right? Or what happens to people who disobey, or they'll use, you know, modern events, right? I've seen this so many times where they'll say, this pigua happened because you did X, Y, and Z. Okay, this horrible, the captives are not being freed because you know, are doing X, Y, and Z. And that's, besides very abusive, it's actually, it's a defamation of the
heresy.
Torah and of everything
it's
that,
heresy.
You know, what about darchei noham? What about not shaming somebody, right? That's all not so important to them. What's important to them is, you know, what happens to whoever, the Nevi'im and the people who went against David HaMelech, right? What was their end? What was the end of Avshalom, the disobedient son, right? So yes, he did have a very sad ending, but to tell a child that for disobeying your father, you'll end up hanging by your own hair from a tree is a real misuse of why HaKadosh Baruch Hu shared these stories with us and gave us this Torah. So the Rambam says that a person should always be careful, lo lahatil ema yitera babayit, not to spread extra fear in the house. That's not, the idea is not to shame somebody into doing our will. And I see this over and over and over again. And it's so, it's painful to see. And this is something which goes, you know, both ways, men and women, right? That women will use things, men will use things. And again, usually they're both very ignorant, or they, you know, they heard one thing, and they'll use it. They'll use it to hurt somebody. And it's so sad. It's so sad and it's so painful.
Well, so firstly, just in response to what you said about women accepting Gittin, I'm always very cautious about statistics because every case is often unique, and what people say a person's not accepting, often it's because an absurd condition has been set. But what I do agree is that this kind of weaponization of religion happens. It happens a lot. As I said, it's ugly, and people throw statements of rabbinic sayings as if that's the be all and end. Just take one example that you mentioned. People can quote the Gemara that says, when a divorce of your first wife, by the way, it says happens, the altar cries. Now, what they omit to say is the Torah lists divorce as a mitzvah. They omit to say that, which Girushin is one of the Tarag mitzvot. What they omit to say is that the rabbis have a whole tractate about Gitin, because we know that that's sometimes necessary. And the idea of crying, by the way, nobody likes things crying, but I've got 5 daughters. If anybody's got a son and they've given him Brit Milah, generally a baby cries at Brit Milah. To use crying, which is a metaphor there, which is important to know, to use crying as somehow something that should stop something, it'd be as absurd as saying, since a baby cries Brit Milah, you shouldn't give a Brit Milah, which, by the way, that's what anti-Semites say. That's a ziyuf, that's, again, a misrepresentation, a falsification, and defamation of the Torah. So people take one line here, one line there, and they misrepresent things, they weaponize things, they manipulate people, and in so doing, they try and control people. And it is shocking. You mentioned the Rambam. The Rambam is, in fact, just channeling the Gemara Masechet Gitin, Vav Amud Bet, which talks about how there's a prohibition, here specifically addressing men, of instilling excess fear in the home. And moreover, it says, and if you do, not just will you make people sad, and if you do, the consequences will be arayot, illicit relations, bloodshed, right, shvichut damim, and chilul Shabbat, meaning you'll cause way more transgressions from your excess fear for whatever hakbadah you have, which, by the way, the rabbi said that you shouldn't be so makbid, you shouldn't have hakbadot, right, than anything else. And then in particular, they stress on Erev Shabbat or Erev Chag, when there's so much to do, even if there are reminders that need to be made to the home that Shabbos is coming in at this time, do so banachat, right? You should express yourself with a sense of calmness, and this is codified in the Shulchan Aruch. The very fact that people think that by screaming about halachic demands, by instilling fear towards others in the name of law is acceptable, is an aversion of Jewish law. It is horrific. And I have a number of clients. I meet with men, women, and couples. I only meet online. It's important for me to be very clear. And there are a number of married women who are in difficult marriages, whose husbands misrepresent halakha to them. And they'll say to me, is this really the case? They'll be brave enough to call me and say, my husband said I can't do X. Is it true? Now, again, we're not talking about in minhag, in which they've already made a kind of a certain commitment to do X. We're talking about something happens, and then he says X, and then...
Can I guess what the most common one is? The couple's in a fight, and she needs to go to the mikvah, and he says, you have to go, and we are going to have relations. Because if you don't, you're a moredet, you're the rebellious wife, and that's a sin. Because to me, that is like the most common form of religious abuse, I think, that I see, which is that you have to go to the mikvah and you have to have relations no matter what. And besides the fact that it's not true, there are many instances, especially a couple who's already in negotiations for divorce, who is thinking about divorce, who are angry at each other, who are not talking to each other.
It is asur.
It's asur. Not only is it not does she have to go, it's asur. It's forbidden. And it's very clear. It's very clear in halacha. Yet, I have found that so many, and I want to take a leap here, there are, like, as you said, there are many rogue rabbis, or I forgot the term that you used, who will also tell that to women. And I hear it, I got smoke coming out of my ears. That is so abusive.
So just on that point, firstly, I made it clear I only meet people online, and actually I try and avoid, just for reasons of trying to avoid conversations about sex and sexual intimacy with women. I try and avoid it. I encourage women to speak to Yotzat Halacha. I find that to be more appropriate. However, there have been a handful of instances where in an emergency level, somebody will contact me and they need advice, and this is a topic they're asking, and I'll respond. And one instance is just like this. It happened a few years ago. I remember Mamash shaking and crying. It's absolutely true. Where a couple had the husband said we're getting divorced, but she was still living in the family home because unfortunately the system doesn't work the way halakha expects divorce should work. And it's important to know Jewish law says once you decide to divorce, get divorced the first available opportunity, ideally today or tomorrow. Any delay shouldn't ever be claimed to be reflective of the law, the spirit of halakha. It isn't. It is to do with lawyers and money and arrangements. And sometimes, by the way, those things do need to be worked out. Most times they don't need to be worked out before they get. But Jewish law itself says if you decide to get divorced, do it as quickly as possible. However, there are in our modern age periods of time, sometimes lengthy periods of time, where the decision to get divorced and the getting of the get takes a while, not because necessarily anybody's refusing it, but because there's a process happening. And what happens in that moment? Well, they're living on the same roof. Sometimes people can have expectations and demands of one another. And a woman said to me, my husband is interested in being with me. And I said to her, I said, I'll be as direct as possible. If your husband has said that he wants to divorce you, you shouldn't be having relations. And if you don't want to, it's called rape, and you need to be calling the police. And it's the very fact that that situation could even arise is horrific. The fact that situation arises many times, many more times than people acknowledge, is shocking. But still,
it goes back to a real lack of education in preparing people for marriage, and in their understanding of the halachas of being married. And there's also one other concept which is so misused that goes together. It's two sides of the same coin, and that is that you always have to be mevater. You always have to give in, right? You give in, you always giving in. Vatronis is the best thing in the world. It's, and my high school principal, Rabbi Belsky, alav hashalom, he was talking about this, 40 years ago when nobody was talking about things like codependency. He didn't have the words codependent, but he got the concept. And about being mevater, you're mevater for God. You're mevater for a higher purpose. You're not mevater to someone else. That's sacrificing to somebody else. So Vatronis is a great thing, but it's an overused tool which has been weaponized to hurt people.
But the problem is, and I mean, this is a whole different conversation.
Yeah.
I have a book with a lovely chapter about Vatronis, written by somebody who clearly cares a lot about relationships. But unfortunately, they're not very well educated in halakha. I mean, they're religious, but they lack the kind of sophisticated experience and learning that you and I are talking about.
Maybe we could call them theoretical halachists.
Well, they're not even halachists. Unfortunately, many people speak about Jewish values and Jewish law and know limited things about Jewish values and even less about Jewish law above and beyond what they do. In terms of, I mean, I've been talking for the past few years very, very insistently. We don't educate towards machshava and emunah. And so when people talk, they talk to ideas that sound nice to them, but doesn't necessarily mean they're emes. And it's important to know, not everything that you say, however religiously dressed you are, is emes. There are people who misrepresent Torah, megale panim b'Torah she'elo ka'alacha, in all types and stripes. And sometimes the more religious, the more dangerous they are. But the best way to check them out is ask them where they know that from, and then send that to somebody else and ask them if that's a verifiable source. You do that, by the way, with medicine. Like, is this a good medicine? Right. They say it's made by this company, and then Google, is that a good company or not? Or ask somebody in the field. We need to be a little bit more scrutinizing. So people will talk about Vatronis as a value, but as you say, they then overstretch it. And then people hear it, and if that's not contextualized by saying there are things called boundaries, there are things called no, and you shouldn't be a schmuck in a relationship. And as we were talking before, and no man can make demands that this is what you need to do, especially in terms of sexual intimacy. That if we don't understand that, we're actually enabling.
Absolutely.
Our poor, patchy education is enabling people to be in trouble. And then you and I pick up in our different hats people who are going through strife. But when you look back, you realize not necessarily the other person was evil. The other person sometimes is saying what they think they should be saying, which is even worse. It's even more sickening that we gave them that script. And so I mean, I'm an educator by trade, and so it's absolutely essential that we educate both to a younger age, from a younger age, and in a clearer way about boundaries in every sense of the term. There are many different forms of abuse, as we well know. There are people of religious so-called standing who have done horrific things, and being very clear that Vatranas, especially where somebody wants you to do something which is inappropriate, but supposedly for the name of God, has no place. It's a really, really vile way to bring a good midah, which is supposed to be used in a micro way, to then force people to capitulate, to do horrific things, because somebody in a position of power is wanting them to do so. Now, just by the way, on the topic of power and the topic of marriage, a book was recently published. I think I might have mentioned to you, Girushin Ba'alacha. It's a fascinating, really important book about Dine Girushin by Rabbi Rafael Kreuzer, a great Talmid Chacham. As it happens, I was in contact with him this morning. As it happens, I was in contact with him about a sheila of Girushin this morning. I'm doing a wedding later on. You know, it just shows you how between one and the other. But I want to quote to you one line from his book. It's a really important sefer and very, very well researched, and it's been very, very well received. But here we're talking about control, and he says, I'll translate. I know not for you. A man who insists that his wife may not, leave the house for example, social events, or insists that she can't go out to work, or just act like a normal woman, however that's defined. This is a reason to demand that he gives a get, meaning that's called grounds for divorce and abuse. A man does not have the right to control his wife. A wife, by the way, doesn't have the right to control her husband. We spoke about flexibility. There will be always disagreement in a marriage, and sometimes they'll hit on questions to do with religion, custom, preferences, etc. And sometimes you need to ask for guidance. That's why we encourage people to have a rabbi who is hopefully as sensitive to the man and to the woman. I'm going to go back to that in a second. But abusive behavior in marriage, either as a result of religion or through using the name of religion or stam, is prohibited, and literally it says it in the book. There you go. But I just want to talk to 1 second about having a rabbi. I'm this virtual rabbi. I'm a rabbi to men and their couples. If a couple have a rabbi, but a woman, okay, let's phrase it differently. To really be a rabbi who gives halachic decisions to people, you need to know those people. Okay? This is a basic 101 thing about anything. We're not talking again about simple objective things. Is this matzah kosher? I don't need to know you necessarily to know if this matzah is kosher. That's a question about the matzah.
Right.
But any kind
hotline for that.
Right. But any kind of complex issue where there's an interface of people and practice, right? There's text and context. There is law and practitioners of the law, whatever. You need to know who you're talking to. Again, my teacher was just a pure expert in this. Now, if the Rav that you may go to as a couple, if you have such a thing, knows a husband well and doesn't know the wife at all, doesn't know who she is at all, he is not equipped to give advice to them as a couple. He's really equipped to give advice to him as a man, while being perhaps aware that he's married to this lady. Now, sometimes, by the way, rabbis will overcompensate. they'll say, since I don't know her, I'll just be overly sensitive to her, but that may not necessarily show an understanding of who she is or what her needs are. If you as a couple choose to have a go-to person, that go-to person has to have some knowledge of. That doesn't mean you should go out for coffee and have a whole long schmooze. Have some knowledge of who is this person. Because unless you know who you're talking to, it is possible that even the well-intending rabbi giving advice to a couple where they may have issues, not necessarily abuse, but there's tensions arising from minhagim, is ultimately making decisions informed by who this man is, but ill-informed about who this woman is.
As you're talking, the first example that comes to my mind is birth control. When to use birth control, when it's okay. And so you'll have, I've seen this a lot where, one of the spouses will say, no way are we using birth control ever, right? It says, Ba'erev al Tanach Yadecha, the Shoshana, the first mitzvah of the Torah, we're not ever using it. And that's not fair. Not only is it not fair, but and then, one of them will go to the Rav, and the Rav will give them a one-sided psak. So you can't give a one-sided psak on birth control to a husband or to a wife, because they're both taking responsibility for this potential child.
Well, to say they're both, let's be perfectly clear, one's going to be carrying it, one's not. So if we say both,
one of them is I've met women who used to go on birth control, no matter what. Their husband says, I cannot handle it. I cannot handle any more kids. I can't handle the financial burden. I can't handle the noise. I used to, many years ago, it's going back almost 20 years ago, I translated a website for a rogue rabbi. I'll definitely call him a rogue rabbi. I would say his name, but I don't want to get sued. So I was translating his website for him. And one of the questions was from a couple who they were living in Canada. They're asking the rabbi through the website, they're balei tshuva, they have 3 kids under 4, and they want to go on, the wife wants to go on birth control. The husband, I don't remember which one, wanted to say, let's take a break. Can they take a break? And he answered back to them, no, you shouldn't take a break. And every baby that comes into the world is bracha. And I'm like, I'm not translating that. I quit. I'm not going to have my hand in that. And then you have, great tzaddikim like the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who used to tell, especially balei tshuva, he said to them, try, didn't say you have to, try to have one more kid than the family that you grew up in. So if you grew up with 2 siblings in your family, try to have a 3rd. That's to me, that's wow, that's brilliant, right? You can't take people who are not used to having kids around, never held a baby in their life, and they're popping them out every year. That is a recipe for divorce. And then what do you do? Because they can't have, single parents, he's got to provide, and she's got to, it doesn't work. It's a recipe for disaster.
It is, but this is probably a good point, and we've got 1 or 2 other things to cover, but this is a good point to make it clear. I said before, I'm not a therapist, I don't purport to be. Rabbis need to know their lane. I try and know Jewish law quite well in the areas which I'm qualified, that I've studied. But I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a therapist. I can't evaluate the capacity for somebody. I can evaluate what the flexibility and nuance of Jewish law, where somebody has a single mindset, which is generally wrong. Meaning, if somebody says, I'm supposed to have kids, I'd say, let's have a conversation. Let me educate you about what that actually means and the considerations of all these other factors, etc. And your wife is not obliged to have children, and so let's talk through. And of course, there are emotional factors, etc. But firstly, you sometimes need other professionals to intervene. I said to you at the beginning of our session, I'd reached out to you because every rabbi needs to have a list of professionals that they go to or make recommendations to where their expertise ends and somebody else begins, or where there is some kind of overlap. And when it comes to questions perhaps about children, it is a complicated question which isn't purely halachic. And so you need to kind of know what is even being asked of me, and what can I say, and what should I not be necessarily commenting on? Because, okay, to take a random example, and I've not answered questions on this, but this could easily happen. There is Rav Moshe Feinstein has a response about having cosmetic plastic surgery. The Tzitz Eliezer Waldenberg has a different view. My teacher was Dainopin, he was a Talmud Mubak, Rav Moshe, and I lean in towards Rav Moshe Feinstein's rule. But if somebody were to call me and say, does halacha allow me to have plastic surgery? I can tell you what the ruling is, Rav Moshe Feinstein. But sometimes they're actually asking, should I? I'm not qualified to tell you that at all. That's not my remit. In fact, I probably shouldn't. As I mentioned before, there are many areas where I'm quite reluctant to even have a conversation at all because it's not appropriate, it's not modest. And modesty, by the way, happens even sometimes in terms of what one discusses. So you need to sometimes say, I can tell you in theory what the law says, but perhaps it would be a good idea for you to speak to somebody like this. And that needs to be part of the day-to-day discourse of a rabbi, knowing which other professionals you need to be bringing into a conversation, or at least recommending to be brought in to a conversation. Because if that's not the case, classic examples, which are discussed in kind of rabbinic training books, if somebody says, if somebody commits suicide, will they get buried in a Jewish cemetery? You need to be asking, why is that person asking the question? Sounds like they could well be suicidal. Now, if you're the first person that's talking to them, you need to have kind of almost Ezra Rishonah, first aid of what to do with somebody who could be thinking about suicidality. You do. Every rabbi needs to go to mental health training. I myself have gone to 50 hours and done some more since then. But beyond that, you also need to know who do I need to be bringing in, or whose advice should be turning to if somebody's having these kind of queries. The shaila is just betraying a whole different consideration of this person, possibility that they may be taking their life. So whilst you're talking here about birth control, it's important to know that some questions are asking bigger questions than purely the halachic query itself. And many times, in fact, that's the case. And we need to create an ecosystem, which I'm strongly supportive of, whereby rabbinic professionals turn to other professionals and vice versa as well. I'll just say one more thing on that topic. Oftentimes, rabbis get their knuckles rapped and say, know your lane. And I say, absolutely, you're right. I also say to therapists, know your lane. Please don't give halachic advice unless you're an expert. And I'd say the same to doctors and other things. And often they're not. Sometimes they are, but often they're not. And too often the criticism is in one direction, but actually there have been times where couples have had to divorce because of absolutely obscene advice given by therapists, which are totally contrary to halakha. And that's a tragedy. So we all need to, all professionals need to be humble enough to say, we add what we can, but oftentimes we need to default to others when other questions arise. But we still have an important distinction to make, and I'm aware of time. We've gone on for a bit, which is...
We're going to wrap it up now.
Yeah, so I just want to say, according to Jewish law, there are grounds for divorce. Of course, abuse. But in terms of religion, because we were talking about religious abuse, if let's say a man's wife is not adhering to Torah laws and is hiding that, for example, she claims she's going to mikvah, she's not, that's called a transgression of Dat Moshe, and that would be grounds for divorce. But then there are other behaviors which seem to be much problematic because they imply licentiousness or inappropriate behavior, and we call that Yehudit. It's a little bit more hard to define in any given situation. It's also dependent on social setting necessarily. But there's an important ruling by Rav Moshe Feinstein, I mentioned it earlier on, whereby if a couple were married and she covers her hair and then she chooses not to, which is generally understood by him to be a transgression of Dat Yehudit, that isn't grounds for divorce. That could be grounds for disappointment, could be grounds for confusion, could be grounds for a very deep and meaningful conversation between the couple. But that itself isn't, that's it, we're done. If the couple were done anyway, then that's just a siman, that's not a siba. That's just an indication of where the couple is at, but not necessarily a reason.
It's a symptom.
But to use that, he writes very, very clearly, is inappropriate because nowadays many Jewish women don't cover their hair. A woman who previously did and now doesn't is not acting in a way which is deliberately licentious. She's simply not doing something which she was previously doing. Overall, I mean, we could talk about this again for a long time, but how religion is brought into a marriage, how it is maintained within a marriage, how it is asserted in a marriage, and how it is managed in a marriage is a delicate thing. And too often, both parties aren't experts, and that's fine, because goodwill and a desire to work harmoniously, that's called a perfect marriage. Right? That's it. Nobody expects every couple
to discover together.
Do as you wish, as long as there's goodwill and you want to work together. Basically, everybody can find fault in somebody else. That's not how things work. As long as you're doing things that make you guys happy, fantastic. That's called shalom bayit. But once people weaponize Jewish law and do harm, and especially abuse in the name of law, again, it's ugly, it's wrong, it's forbidden, it's grounds for divorce. But it goes completely against the spirit and the letter of Jewish law. It is anti-halacha to use halacha in a way to cause tension and disharmony and manipulation and control and abuse in a marriage. Anti-halacha. It is worse than bringing treif in your home, worth bring anything else. As the Gemara said before, remember we said it's as if it's going to lead you to arayot, to retzach, to killing, and to chilul Shabbat. If that's what you want, great. But know that choice is taking you to a very bad place and a very wrong place. And we should only act with sensitivity, and people should know divorce is a mitzvah, if need be. But working in a marriage also takes effort. And talking to people with understanding and sensitivity of the moving factors of law in relationships is important, but that requires that both parties are heard and understood, can speak, and can be considered.
Thank you so much. That was very, very insightful. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.